My parents were pretty strict growing up. I wasn't allowed to do most things that most kids my age were doing. And with the story that I'm about to tell you, it makes a lot of sense why. My best friend Sarah lives in our neighborhood, but we didn't attend the same school. We would call each other every weekend, but I was never allowed over her house, which was always annoying to me at the time because she lived 3 doors down from us. Every time I asked to go over, it was never a legitimate reason why, until the summer of my 6th grade year. Sarah and I had become inseparable, and again, we would spend most of the day out and running around the neighborhood. But after, we'd have to go to our respective homes. And I, of course, being a kid, never really wanted the fun to end. So that evening before dinner, I asked my mom if I could stay over Sarah's house. A little last minute, I'll admit. I remember the hesitation in my mom's face as she paused to think about it. I just knew that it was a yes because most of the time, she never hesitated to tell me no. I was already jumping up and down before she said yes. She told me that we'd have to pack a little overnight bag and got me ready. I remember being so giddy, helping my mom pick up pajamas, and she even picked my nail and makeup kit that I never used. I could tell by the end of it, my mom was actually kind of excited too. She called Sarah's mother and walked me over a couple minutes later. When we got there, Sarah almost bulldozed me over, hugging me, thanking my mother over and over again. Both our moms laughed, talked for a little, and then my mom waved goodbye, telling me to call before I went to bed to at least say goodnight. It was around 6 p.m., so it was still daylight out. Sarah's mom, Miss Jennifer, already ordered a couple pizzas for us and told us to go have fun. So, we ran up to Sarah's room and did what stereotypical 12-year-olds do. The pizza came, and we ate with her mom before heading back upstairs to watch movies. I remember feeling so happy but slightly sad that this was the first time I had been over. But the feeling quickly faded when her mother brought us sundaes. She told us there was more down in the kitchen and said that she had to head to bed early. She gave us both a hug and then headed to her room. We stayed up for a couple more hours. It was getting late, so I went down to call my mom, remembering to tell her goodnight. While I was on the phone, Sarah had come down behind me to grab another sundae and a bag of chips. I had just gotten off the phone and was going back to Sarah's room when I noticed her staring at the front door. They had one of those doors that was fully glass and had a plastic blind to open and close if they wanted to look out. I guess Miss Jennifer had just forgotten to shut it, but Sarah was staring directly out the door. I walked over and stopped next to her, looking out with her. "What?" I said, kind of creeped that she hadn't said anything. "I thought I saw someone, but..." and her voice trailed off. "Well, hey, I don't see anything," I said, and walked over to pull the drapes down, checking to make sure the door was locked too, and it was. Sarah stood there for a while longer, and then we headed up to her room again. About 30 minutes later, we both fell asleep watching Hairspray. When I woke up, I heard Sarah talking. I couldn't pinpoint where her voice was, but was about to drift off when I heard a deep man's voice. I shot up out the bed to see a hulking figure in Sarah's window, and her talking quickly, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. When I jumped up, the figure immediately reached out and grabbed at Sarah, trying to pull her out the window. My fight or flight kicked in, and I screamed, running towards him and hitting him with everything I had, which probably wasn't much. We were on the 2nd floor, so this weirdo scaled the side of the house and was hanging from the windowsill. He started cursing at me, trying to get me off him, but still had one hand on Sarah, who now had started to scream, being half slung around by him in the process. Without thinking, I shoved him as hard as I could, and he scrambled out the window, letting go of Sarah, falling to the ground below. Miss Jennifer had come running in just as he fell, so she seemingly saw most of what happened. She grabbed both of us and rushed us out the room, immediately calling the police. My mother got there before the police did. What we all didn't realize was that whoever the guy was still there. When I had pushed him, he fell and broke both his ankles, and had tried crawling away. But when the police got there and checked the house, he was found at the edge of the property. For the next couple of days, Sarah and Miss Jennifer stayed at our house, them both being afraid after what happened. Thankfully, if it wasn't for me pushing him out the window, who knows what would have happened, or what intentions he had towards any of us. He was tried, and I don't know how many years he got, but we never saw him again, and Sarah and I have remained friends to this day. My parents divorced when I was 15 years old, so naturally I spent a lot of time going back and forth from my mother's place to my father's. My mom took me for most of the week, and my dad Friday and the weekend. It was rough at first, but I got into the groove of it eventually. It was my birthday week, and my mother went all out, buying me a present for every day of the week. We celebrated as much as we could with the days we had. I got ready for my dad's and packed everything that was needed. When I arrived at his house, he gave me a quick hug and told me happy birthday. He had to work that night, so I was pretty much going to be there by myself. He did, though, stock the fridge and freezer with all of my favorite foods. And when I got to my bedroom, there was a small gift that he had gotten me laid on my pillow. He had little ways to show that he cared. He left the house around 8, just as the sun was setting. I spent most of the time in my room when my dad wasn't there. The house just felt too lonely without him. I warmed myself up a couple Hot Pockets and went to my room, turning on The Simpsons. I watched it for a while, periodically getting up and snacking on the food that was in the fridge. Every now and then, I would hear a couple of noises come from the basement. It was fairly normal, honestly. The house sort of creaked and groaned a lot of the times. The noises mostly coming directly from the basement. So I just turned up the volume on the TV. It was nearing 10 that my dad called to check on me. He told me that he had gotten me a birthday cake, and had almost forgot about it. He wanted to do the stereotypical singing of happy birthday and blowing out my candles, but he just forgot to take it out. He told me that I could have a piece, and we could still do it if I wanted to. Me, still surprisingly hungry, told him that I would cut off a small piece for myself, but I would leave the rest for us to share together. We talked for a little bit more, and then we hung up. I watched a little bit more TV before heading down to the basement, which was where the big chest freezer was. I opened it and smiled to myself, seeing all of my favorite frozen goodies. I was going to be 1,000 pounds before I left my dad's with all the food he had for me. It kind of made up for the fact that he couldn't be there, even though I knew he couldn't help it. I pulled out my cake from the freezer and headed upstairs, turning out the light and pulling the door closed. I took my slice and settled back into the bed. Before I knew it, I was drifting off. My dad got off at 1 a.m. most days. I woke up to hearing his keys in the door. He walked down the hall to my room, wishing me a last happy birthday before he went into his room to sleep. I laid there for a while, staring up at the ceiling, when I heard a light scratching sound. It was barely noticeable. Probably mice, I thought, and went to sleep. The next night, I spent most of it with my dad, watching horror movies. But that night again, I heard the scratching. This time, it came with tiny little taps, all in 4-second increments. I decided the next morning I would tell my dad. I was leaving and wanted to make sure he knew about it before I left. The rest of that week went normal. I went back home to my mom's. When Thursday night rolled around, I got ready to see my dad again the next morning. My best friend Bailey was supposed to spend the night, and I was super excited. My dad left the fridge stocked again. My mom dropped Bailey and I off around 4 something. By that time, my dad was already gone. So we grabbed a bunch of snacks and went to my room. My dad had 2 big bags of old clothes that he was going to throw away. Bailey loved older clothes, no offense to my dad, of course. Before he left, he said that if Bailey wanted them, that she could have them, and left them sitting in the living room for her. We goofed around for a while, watching what we wanted and eating the never-ending goodies in the fridge. I mentioned that my dad had a lot of frozen desserts in the basement. Bailey, who loved popsicles, asked if she could go get one, which I offered to get it for her myself, but she insisted. She told me to pick a movie for us to watch and walk down to the basement. She came back up a few minutes later, and we watched a couple movies before switching over to TV, watching a couple reruns of Family Guy. I was drifting off when I heard the tapping again, and this time it was much louder. It was more so a thumping than a tapping at this point. I could almost feel it through the floor. I waited listening, but the tapping didn't change. Nor did it really stop. It surprised me that it wasn't bothering her. I wondered if she even noticed. I eventually fell asleep, but the next night, the last night that Bailey was supposed to be there, it happened again. This time with much more intensity than the last. But like the first time I heard it, it was accompanied by scratches. They sounded really sharp and curt. Before I thought it was mice, but honestly it sounded like a huge animal was down in the basement. Bailey and I argued for a long time what we should do about it. I knew that there was no legitimate way for any huge animal to get into the basement. The only access way to the basement was the door leading down. It made no logical sense how anything as big as what we were hearing was down in the basement. Unless they bust through a wall, but none of it was plausible. The more the noises went on, the more anxious Bailey became. It was scary to me too, I'll admit, but I honestly didn't know what to do. Bailey offered to call the police, and for some unknown reason it irritated me. This clearly had to be some type of malfunction with the basement lights or the plumbing. Now rereading this back to myself, I understand how stupid that sounds, but in my 16-year-old head, it made complete sense. I told Bailey that I would head down to the basement and see what the issue was, ruling out that it couldn't be an animal, and slowly chalking it up to being electrical. I started to worry that whatever it was would eventually catch on fire with the noises. Bailey literally almost clawed me to death trying to keep me upstairs, but I broke free from her and opened the basement door. As soon as the door opened and the light illuminated the stairs, the noises stopped. Now that the noises were gone, I completely lost all my courage. Bailey came around the corner and stood next to me on the stairs. "I'm not going to let you go alone, dummy," she said. I honestly don't know why I still went down there, but I did. Bailey close behind me. I walked down the steps slowly, feeling for the light switch. There were two. The first light bulb hung a few feet from the staircase, but the second one hung from the middle of the basement. I flicked both on, but the second bulb burst, making Bailey scream. In the small amount of time that the room was illuminated, I didn't see anything. We didn't have much in the basement besides an old comforter that was my grandma's, the freezer, and a couple boxes that lined the back wall. If anything was there, I would have seen it, but I didn't see anything. Bailey started looking around a little bit more behind me, I guess now relieved that she didn't see anything. I stood there for a while, eyeing the basement, which was now in low light because of the bulb. I was waiting to hear any noise, but again it was silence. Behind me, Bailey was walking around softly. My eyes caught movement to the right near my grandmother's chair, but it looked strange. It looked like my dad had hung black strips of fabric over the chair. I had no idea why. He barely came down here too, until it moved. One strip moved and raised up to tap the ceiling. I heard the familiar tap and saw what now appeared to be a long black nail of some kind. I heard Bailey stop when she heard the noise. It echoed throughout the basement. As my mind registered what was happening, I screamed at Bailey to run. She stood frozen by the base of the steps, and I yanked her up with me, dragging her up the steps, screaming the entire time. I didn't know what to do, but I knew we had to get out. I've never experienced anything like this. You know how you witness something you didn't even know was possible? Bailey was beside herself and wanted to go home, but I kept insisting that I couldn't be there by myself. I eventually was able to calm her down. We stayed in my dad's room the rest of the night and barricaded ourselves in. It made us feel safer that it was the farthest room from the basement. Bailey begged my dad to take her home when he arrived, and he obliged. After talking to Bailey a couple days after, she told me she didn't see anything, until she remembered the night prior. When she had gone downstairs to grab her popsicle, she had only flicked on the first light, again the one hanging a few feet from the stairs. She made her way over and opened up the freezer, grabbing a couple, when she noticed my grandmother's armchair. According to her, The nail or claws that I had seen from whatever this was had been in the same exact spot, but to her, in the low light, looked as if it were a bunch of clothes piled up and slung over the chair. I was kind of a rebellious kid growing up. I gave my parents hell, and I paid for it every day. But that's another story. I was 17, and my friends and I wanted to have a sleepover, but because I had such a rebellious streak, my parents wouldn't let me go. I know now as a full functioning adult, it was my fault I couldn't go. I barely passed my junior year. I was mouthy. I treated my siblings crappy. It made a lot of sense why I couldn't. But again, at that time, I did what I wanted, regardless of the implications. I was planning a party with my 4 best friends, Jeannie, Rissa, Stephanie, and Angel. Jeannie and Steph were responsible for the alcohol. Rissa brought the ganja, for lack of a better word, and Angel and I were responsible for the boys. I asked my parents at 7 p.m. By 10, I was already headed out. Sneaking out my window and meeting Rissa at the end of my street. She had already done her part. The car smelled like it. We dropped by one of the boys' house and picked up 3 of them. The rest had to hitch a ride with someone else. The boys we picked up were Jonathan, Tyler, and Smith, my crush. While we were on the way to Steph's house, which is where the party was supposed to be at, she called and said her parents had come home early from their supposed month-long trip, and we had to have it somewhere else. Me thinking on my toes, I found the nearest hotel and booked it. They took walk-ins. I looked the oldest and figured it wasn't going to be a problem to get us in, fake ID and all. It all worked out smoothly, even though I was panicking in the back seat. We got to the hotel and I acted like the adult, played my part, and got us all in. The boys came in separately, but by that point the receptionist probably peeped what was happening. They didn't really seem to care according to the rest of the friends that came through. We got to the hotel and started setting up, making it cozy. Smith made it very clear he was interested, so I was getting hyped for the start of the party. By the time everyone got there, the room was almost packed. Picture about 30 people in one room. Smith and I smoked and fooled around for a while, and the party reached its peak at around 1 a.m. Here's where things took a turn for the worst. Where our room was located, right next to our room, was a hallway that led out to a side door in the hotel that locked when you closed it. It led to a balcony where you could get down the side of the hotel by a long metal staircase. That's how we got some of our other friends in. The party was lit. The room was full of smoke, music, and laughter. I was really having a good time till I heard a knock on the door. I was walking past the door heading to the bathroom. Since I was the closest, I opened it to a middle-aged man. He had a black jacket with blue jeans and black work boots. I'll never forget. When I opened it, I looked up at him, and he smiled really wide. I stared back, wondering what he wanted. "Room service," he blurted out. Me eyeing him and seeing him not even in the uniform of the hotel, slammed the door and locked it, thinking he was creepy. Everybody agreed to be on the lookout for him, and the party continued. A couple minutes later, we heard a loud scream come from outside. One of the boys was heading out the door when we all heard it. The music was changing, so it was quiet when we heard the scream. Everyone tried to rush out the door at once, but when the people at the front headed out the door, I heard multiple screams and yells. By the time I made it out, we were all lined up outside. At the front of the hallway, I could see a couple of boys pummeling someone, screaming at the top of their lungs, Smith being one of them. As I got closer, I noticed it was the same guy from before. One of them screamed to call the police. They had him pinned to the ground at the beginning of the hallway, when I noticed the door propped open. Farther down the hallway, a pair of feet sticking out. I rushed down the hall, pushing it open to a scene I'll never forget. 3 of our friends were tied and gagged when the fire escaped. One of them had fallen halfway down the metal stairs, I guess in an attempt to get away. I screamed for help and tried undoing the restraints on them. The rest of that night was a blur. The police were called and the man was arrested. We all obviously were in serious trouble because there were so many people at the party. Each time one of our friends went out the room for whatever reason, the man was waiting in the hallway, picking us off the longer the night went on. He had his car parked on the side of the hotel where the steps led to. It wasn't until the cops got there that we noticed Angel was missing. She wasn't on the balcony, but she was found in the man's car. She had left out for one reason or the other, and he struck her on the head, knocking her unconscious. But unfortunately, the way he hit her, she succumbed to her head wound and died a couple minutes later, according to her autopsy. As far as the other girls, they were able to gain consciousness. They weren't harmed badly, bruised mostly and scared. I blame myself for her passing every day. I planned the party, was too stubborn to accept the fact that we all should have gone home, but instead I picked that hotel, picked the location, and regardless of my friend's family and Angel's family telling me it wasn't my fault, I've always felt like it. If it wasn't for me, she would still be alive, and it's something I think about every single day.